January 1945. The Red Army was relentlessly advancing through Poland, driven by years of sacrifice. The Nazis, once invincible, were now in retreat. The Vistula-Oder offensive had shattered the German lines. The Soviets, hardened by a brutal conflict, were penetrating deeper into the crumbling Reich. They had seen the scars of war etched into their homeland and witnessed firsthand the Nazi cruelty. Weary from the war, which began on January 12, 1945, and commanded by Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev, the Vistula-Oder offensive was one of the most successful military operations of World War II. When it ended, 40 days later, on February 2, 1945, the Soviets had penetrated up to 800 kilometers into territory controlled by the Germans. The Vistula-Oder offensive was a success in terms of territorial gains, even greater than the Soviet Bagration offensive the previous year. It might only be surpassed in terms of speed by another Soviet offensive, which was the attack on the Japanese in Manchuria in August 1945, but that will be covered in another video. You can see the map of the Oder-Vistula offensive, with the Soviets starting near Warsaw and penetrating deep into Germany and the industrial region of Silesia as well. One of the Soviet military objectives was to prevent the retreating German troops from destroying the Silesian industrial complex. This objective was brilliantly achieved by Marshal Konev's troops. But one of the surprises, which also blends, in fact, with a disappointment in the human race, more tragic than the Soviets encountered on their path, was the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau prisoner camp on January 27, 1945. Today, therefore, marks 78 years. We will continue to watch the story of this epic liberation, whose heroes Western Europe seems to want to forget. Despite the harsh winter and adverse conditions, their determination never wavered. The Red Army, although aware of the Nazi atrocities, remained largely in the dark about Auschwitz. Rumors had circulated, whispers of unspeakable horrors within the camps. However, nothing could have prepared them for the reality in occupied Poland. The Soviets were focused on large-scale military objectives, so Auschwitz was just another point on the map until then. The fog of war obscured the full picture of Nazi atrocities. The scale of the genocide remained largely unknown to the advancing Soviet forces. Even as they liberated cities, the full horror of Auschwitz remained hidden. The retreating Germans tried to hide their crimes, but the Germans could not hide all traces of the barbarity.
Os alemães não conseguiram esconder todos os vestígios da barbárie à medida que os soviéticos avançavam pelos territórios ocupados.
As the Soviets advanced through territories occupied by Germany, the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps became increasingly apparent. On January 27, 1945, elements of the First Ukrainian Front approached Auschwitz. The air was thick with a strange, acrid smell. As they neared the camp's perimeter, they were met with a sight that would forever be etched in their memories. The gates of Auschwitz, with the chilling inscription, Arbeit macht frei, were open. Inside, an unimaginable scene of horror unfolded. The ground was littered with emaciated corpses, and survivors too weak to flee emerged from the shadows.
Emergiram das sombras. Os soviéticos.
The Soviets were met with a deafening silence, a testament to the horrors inside. Gas chambers, crematoria, and piles of human ashes revealed the true purpose of the camp. The news of Auschwitz's liberation spread like wildfire. The world, still recovering from World War II, was confronted with the full extent of Nazi barbarism. Images of emaciated survivors and piles of corpses were splashed across newspapers and newsreels. Survivors' testimonies shocked the world's conscience. They spoke of gas chambers, medical experiments, and systematic torture. Soviet soldiers, hardened by war, were deeply affected by what they witnessed. Many wrote letters home, describing scenes of unimaginable cruelty. Their testimonies, along with the accounts of survivors, exposed the true nature of the Nazi regime. The liberation of Auschwitz marked a turning point in history, breaking the wall of secrecy surrounding the extermination camps. Auschwitz became a symbol of the Holocaust, a chilling reminder of human depravity and the resilience of the human spirit. Now, the story that doesn't circulate on social media needs to be told about the behind the scenes of the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. Marshal Konev was the commander of the First Ukrainian Front. The Soviets used the determination of the front. When we talk about the Soviet front, it's equivalent to an army group in the West. So Konev had more or less the role in the West of a Montgomery or a Patton. So what happens? Auschwitz is located more or less south of Katowice, and they were heading towards Silesia, as I mentioned, because they needed to prevent the destruction of that industrial sector and encountered the concentration camp along the way. But there are some things we need to tell you. 4 divisions of the 60th Army took part in the liberation of that region of Auschwitz. The 100th Division, the 107th, the 148th, and the 322nd. The first scouts were the soldiers of the 454th Infantry Regiment from General Klasovin's 100th Division, who entered the camp complex in the early hours of a Saturday, January 27th. However, 231 soldiers of the Red Army died in the operations to liberate the camp and the region, including the commander of the 472nd Infantry Regiment, Colonel Semembert Trovasny, and also soldiers from the 66th Soviet Army lost their lives there. These soldiers were buried in the municipal cemetery of Auschwitz, there in Polish territory. Now, let's take a look at the career of Konev, a marshal we need to know. When we talk about the Soviet Union, we always mention Zhukov, we talk about Rokossovsky, we talk about Chuikov from Stalingrad, but we forget about Konev. He is a very important general, a very important marshal of the Soviet Army. Let's learn a little more about him. So there's Konev. He was born in 1897. He was a sergeant in the Tsarist army, which is quite interesting. Many people who were sergeants or soldiers in the Tsarist army later reached other positions in the Soviet army, including Rodion Malinovsky, who became the chief of the Soviet General Staff. He was a soldier in World War I. Konev was highly admired by Stalin, so much so that during the defense of Moscow, Stalin promoted Konev to colonel general. He also participated in the Battle of Kursk with distinction, because in the Battle of Kursk, Konev executed a maskirovka, a very effective camouflage of his troops, and greatly deceived the Germans. He was a very good tactician. In 1945, he was also assigned, along with Zhukov, to take Berlin. However, what ended up happening was that Stalin gave Zhukov the prerogative to raise the German flag in that famous photo, while Konev was further south and made contact with elements of the American army in Torgau during the junction between the Soviets and Americans on April 25, 1945. He also captured Prague in May 1945.
Ele também conquistou Praga em maio de 1945. Então, gente, tá aí a história pouco conhecida do...
So, folks, there's the little-known story of the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp. Here's what happens. We need to clarify a few things. Recently, there were commemorations, and they didn't invite the Russians. It's ridiculous. They were the ones who liberated it. Or were they the ones who won World War II? This is a fact. 27 million Russian soldiers, military personnel, and civilians lost their lives. And we have to remember that Hitler was financed by the West. It's more than proven that major companies gave money to Hitler. Ford was an admirer of Hitler. A good portion of the trucks used by the Wehrmacht were Opel. Opel was Ford's subsidiary in Germany. Anyway, it's quite a complex story. It seems like the West wants to sweep it under the rug. But now, with the advent of social media, it will be more difficult. So that was our video for today. Okay, folks? I made this video with a lot of care, and I must confess to you that I made it with emotion, because the liberation of Auschwitz is something that deeply affects us. Humanity degraded a lot there with those concentration camps. This is true. We hit rock bottom, and this injustice that exists with not just the Russians, the Soviets, because in the Russian army, there were Kazakhs, there were Ukrainians, there were Georgians, there were Azerbaijanis, there were Armenians. Everything you can think of was in the Soviet army. It's a very great injustice. We also have to remember that January 27th was the day the Kiss nightclub caught fire, where hundreds of young Brazilians lost their lives. It's truly a very sad day for Brazil. So that was our video for today. Comment on what you think about the liberation of Auschwitz, the role of the Soviets in World War II. And it's also interesting to hear your thoughts and perceptions about the fact that Russian authorities were not invited to the ceremonies for the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. We'll be back shortly, always with responsibility and commitment.
Sempre com responsabilidade e compromisso. Fé no Brasil, pessoal. Até mais. Somente a seção de livros.
And faith in Brazil, folks. See you later. Just the book section of Amazon's online store has over 5,000 items about World War II. And I remember that Amazon doesn't just sell books. It sells DVDs, documentaries, items in short, an endless series of items related to World War II. You can find the Amazon wish list in the description of our video. And I always remind you, every time you buy books or any other items through our channel's wish list, you are helping Arte da Guerra, because a portion of the commission from the items sold is converted into revenue for our channel.
Como receita para o nosso canal.
Subtitled by Sonia Roberti.